So if you don't mind, just go ahead and do that right now, and then I'll be able to check in there. And I've got a few points along the way where I'll ask for your participation. If we're a small group, we can probably do some audio, but most likely we'll just have people typing into the chat box. So if you don't mind doing a little bit of introduction as I start to talk today. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate the introduction. I'm going to talk about Logframes. I worked with Lingos for several years with Mike and Gus and others that I taught project management for development professionals, PMD Pro 1 and 2, and was kind of one of the people who kept pushing more and more about Logframes, which I think are extremely important. So John and Mike asked me to take the lead on this. Thanks for the introductions, Robert. Appreciate it. Oh yeah, Robert, we know each other. Sophie, thanks. Stars Foundation, and Gus, I know you. Great. So I'm going to talk about Logframe, and I guess I'll find out maybe by the feedback that I get sort of how advanced this group is in terms of knowledge, because it's always difficult to sort of know how detailed to get, but I'll assume that maybe I'll start with an overview, is that a Logframe usually looks something like this, and it's very simplified format. And in the PMD Pro, we always taught that it's a 4x4 matrix with 16 cells of information, not counting the titles. And so you've got, what I'll talk about is the vertical logic, the hierarchy of objectives, and then you've got what I call, and I think PMD Pro still does, the horizontal logic. And so that's basically what a Logframe looks like, just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And I'd like to hear from you. I'm going to ask you a couple questions. I just want you to put some feedback into the chat. Just give me some idea of what you think makes for a good Logframe. If you could just type in a couple of things, and then that'll help to get me started. What do you think makes for a good Logframe? Just type in a few thoughts into the chat, and I'll just turn off my mic just for a minute to get a sip of coffee here. Clear outcomes, yeah, that's right. You could say probably clear objectives, all of the outcomes, including the goal, the outcomes, the output, and the activities. Okay, somebody's writing on the board. That's great. Connects the activities of the project to the outcomes of the project. So you want to have the objectives connected to each other, and the activities connecting to the outcomes. You also would want the outcomes to connect to the outputs, and I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Robert says, integrated and results-oriented sequence from activities all the way to goals. Absolutely. I can tell you're a Logframe star. Okay. Great. Yeah, clear connections. Thanks for doing that. Keep answering that question if you want, and I'm going to ask one more question that will push it a little bit farther. What challenges are there when using Logframes? Do you have any challenges? And what are some of the challenges that you have when you try to use Logframes? So go ahead and give me just a little bit of feedback there before I sort of launch into my little spiel about Logframes. I'll turn my mic off just for a minute. Okay, they can become either very large, that's right, they can become very complicated, or are brief to cover the details of the project. Right, so they can either become too complicated to be easily understood, or they're too brief and too summarized to really provide the details that are needed to implement the project. That's a great comment, and I'll actually be talking about that at least by the time I end this 1-hour session, because that's an extremely important point. Here's another one. There can be a very thin line in differentiating outcomes and outputs. Absolutely. You've put your finger on one of them. And then over here we've got in the chat, getting everyone on the same page at the indicator level. Absolutely. Indicators are very difficult to write, and then maybe very difficult to measure. Sophie says, don't always leave space for new opportunities that come along. Yeah, good point, that sometimes we can have a log frame that freezes us from innovation or from adaptation that's necessary to do the job well. Okay, thanks. You can keep typing into the chat if you want. Just in the interest of time, though, let me move along to talk about what are the purposes of the log frame. First of all, it's a systematic tool, a tool of logic for organizing project thinking and identifying relationships between the resources, activities, and the project results. And it's a visual communication tool. So the log frame is not the reality itself. It is a picture of the reality. So if we were face to face, I could give you show you a picture of a member of my family, and you could say, okay, now having looked at that picture, I know this member of your family, but you really wouldn't. You would only have seen an image of a member of my family. You wouldn't certainly know that person in the same way you would if you had met them personally or if you interacted with them as a member of the family. So a log frame really is just that photograph, that picture of the reality. But it is a very important visual communication tool. And then near and dear to the heart of many of us, it's a monitoring tool to be able to measure progress. It provides the metrics, the indicators, and the sources of verification. So that's extremely important. And then as a result of the PMD Pro work, to a large extent, I've really come to appreciate that a log frame is really the beginning of risk management. It's a risk management tool to identify and assess the risk that will influence implementation. And I'll talk about that more as we go through this next few minutes, because that has to do, to a large extent, with the assumptions. The assumptions are the beginning of risk management. So just keep that in mind as we move forward, so that you can ask some questions of clarification. And by the way, ask questions at any point. You can type into the chat, and we're a small enough group if you want to raise your hand. I think we can do the audio as well. So either way, and Mike and Robert, others will probably monitor the chat. So let's just keep going, and I'll let you go ahead and interrupt me. I don't mind that. Now, there used to be, and there still is to some extent, a difference in terms of how the log frame is organized, or what's in the log frame, or what are the categories that frame the log frame. So the way that we have done it in the PMD Pro isn't necessarily consistent with every organization. And so there was, at one point in time, a development professional, a guy by the name of Jim Rue, who put together a graphic. He called it the Rosetta Stone of log frames. And the Rosetta Stone, the original Rosetta Stone, as I have at the bottom of the slide here, is a stone found in Egypt with writing on it in 2 languages using 3 scripts. So this is trying to show you that there are different languages, different scripts that are used in organizations. Donors in particular can force their own frameworks on you, especially if you want to be successful in obtaining funding. and they'll have different levels in the hierarchy of objectives. But the bottom line is that there is commonality in the logic of how the objectives or the hierarchy of objectives flow. They all have some kind of ultimate change that is fed into by intermediate change, that is fed into by tangible change, which is at the source specific interventions. So it goes, specific interventions contribute to tangible change contributes to intermediate change contributes to ultimate change. But the names that they give for these different general categories is similar in some cases and different in others. For example, let's start where the similarities are in specific interventions. Almost everyone calls the specific interventions inputs and activities. So there's very little disagreement there. Tangible change, there's also a lot of agreement. It's mostly called outputs. Those are the things that are produced or the processes that have been done to produce some kind of campaign or set of activities. But then here's where we see a lot of differences in the intermediate change, as somebody already mentioned in the previous slide that I had about some of the challenges. The outcome level is what we normally call this, so most organizations will call intermediate change outcomes. But then we have a lot of organizations that will split this into two different levels. So you have higher level intermediate change and lower level intermediate change, which actually makes a lot of sense because there can be changes that are sort of on the micro level, the macro level can be with a certain population group or with a larger population group. And so you've got groups like many of you are familiar with USAID. They're going to talk about strategic objectives and intermediate results. And if I had to, I'd probably squeeze that strategic objective at least in between these two columns because it does actually have to do with some intermediate change, because I think with USAID you still have a goal level that you're dealing with. So I could add that there. So there's nothing wrong with dividing this into two different levels. It's just the confusion is that we sometimes have different terminology that's used there. The ultimate change, there's quite a bit of an agreement here. Usually that's called goal. Sometimes we talk about impact. Impact isn't always a specific level, but it can mean a type of change that is longer term and with a larger population. So just so you know that there's sort of a difference in terms of how the terminology is presented. If you're in an organization that is doing Logframes, you probably have your own adopted way of doing it. If you're writing proposals or implementing projects with certain donors, then you're probably following what they want you to do. In many cases, you may have multiple formats that you're using within an organization. So here's a review question. And you can either use your polling, if you know what that is, that's right above where the list of names is. If you go to the fourth icon and put your cursor on top, you'll see A, B, C, D. You can vote, or you can just type it into the chat, or you can mark a screen. But just answer this question just to see if you understood what I just said. Despite the variations between the logical framework models, what do they all share in common? Do they use the same number of levels in the matrix? Do they use the same underlying logic? Do they use the same terminology, or do they use all of these, all of the above? Thank you. The obvious answer is B. They use the same underlying logic. Thanks. Just a quick review. So let's talk about the specific of the various aspects of the Logframe. The first and probably most fundamental would be the levels of the Logframe. I like to call this the hierarchy of objectives, or the vertical logic. So you, in the simplest format, have activities, outputs, outcomes, and goal. And as someone said in the opening. The most confusing are probably the outputs and the outcomes. We tend to be much clearer on goal being the highest level of change and activities being those things that we do. Outputs then are the tangible changes. The outcomes then are the intermediate level changes, as I was showing you on the Rosetta Stone slide. So the vertical logic vertical logic of the log frames works something like this. The way that I like to understand or read the logic is that I say, okay, you have to do activities to accomplish outputs. You have to accomplish outputs to contribute to outcomes. You have to do outcomes to contribute to your goal. So you can say something like this. If adequate resources and inputs are provided, and by the way, we could put inputs down here as well, but that's something that's probably more to do with the specific project management than it is with the logic, because that type of thing will come later and flow pretty much logically according to the activities that you have. But you say if you have adequate resources and inputs that are provided, then the activities can be conducted. If the activities are conducted, then the outputs can be produced. If the outputs are produced, then the outcomes will occur. If the outcomes occur, then this should contribute to the goal. All right, so that then would be the way that you could read the logic. You can read the logic from the middle out, from the top down. The idea is that you need to have a logical flow between your objectives, and that's called the vertical logic. So some hints for writing statements when it actually comes to the practical. We've got, let me start with activities maybe. Activities are the easiest, and those are the tasks. Those are the things that you're doing to carry out and deliver the outputs. So you need to have the detailed activities, and those are action verbs when you're writing those: prepare, design, construct, research, etc. Those are relatively easy. Those are atomized types of things that you're doing. And then a group of activities will then result in an output. And the outputs then are the direct tangible results. Often they're goods or services that the project delivers, and which are largely under the project management control. Now, I didn't mention the difference between project and program here. Maybe I assumed that most of you would know, but there can then be a program goal that would be above a project goal. So let's assume that this is the hierarchy of objectives for a project. You might then have another level that would be a program goal, and you might have what's called nested log frames. You might have several projects that would feed into a program. And likewise, you could have programs that feed into portfolios. So you can have a nesting of log frames as well. All right, so back to my point here is that outputs then are the direct tangible results, goods and services, that are largely under the project manager's control. Very important point, especially in light of PMD Pro. These are the things that you need to make sure are produced or done in the project. If they're not, then you're not controlling or managing your project correctly. And these are usually, when you're writing a log frame, done in the past tense: produced, built, understood, delivered, etc. Because you're projecting that these actually are going to be done. All right, third level then is probably the most difficult, but maybe the most important. Like I said, in the Rosetta Stone side, sometimes organizations will split this into a lower and a higher level, and that's fine. This is the development change expected at the end of the project, more specifically, benefits to the target group. So it's not the whole population necessarily, it's to the target group, but it is a development change so that there can be other factors that have to come true or happen in order for this to take place. In other words, it's not totally under the control of the project manager. It is something that is influenced because there may be other factors that have to happen. The assumptions have to come true. So this is usually stated in the past tense, even though I've seen it done in the future tense as well. So you can do it either way. In the PMD Pro, we've just simplified and said that, well, let's do this one in past tense, increased, improved, etc. And then goal is your highest level of change at the project level. That's the broad development impact which the project contributes at a national or a sectoral level, and usually you're trying to be aspirational in stating these: to increase, to improve, etc. Okay, any comments or questions on this? That's the hierarchy of objectives, or the vertical logic. Now, just so we can, you can give me a break from talking and give you a little bit of application, I want you to read this very simple hierarchy of objectives for this project. Actually is from the case study that's in the PMD Pro, but that doesn't really matter. Just read it. And I know it's not detailed enough, it's not complete, but there are a couple of major flaws in here. I want you to read this, study it, and then if you can type into the chat, or if you want to write on the screen or type onto the, or turn on your microphone, raise your hand, you can do that. But see if you can find something that you would improve if you were reviewing this for somebody. What would you say about this hierarchy of objectives? There's something really seriously wrong with it. So I'm going to turn off my mic, take a look at it, see if you can identify something, and then communicate back to me in some way before I sort of give you my perspective on it. So go ahead and do that. Either a lot of thinking going on, or people are too shy to share. I'll give you just a little bit longer, and then I'll go ahead and talk. Thinking. let's take that as the positive one, Mike. I agree. Not an easy question, especially if you're new to Logframes, but someone who works a lot with Logframes will usually look at this and very quickly come up with something that is needs to be improved, let's put it that way, about this Logframe hierarchy of objectives. We're just looking at the flow, so I'll give you a little bit longer. All right, Gus, perhaps the outputs are not specific enough. Absolutely. You're definitely right. These outputs are not specific enough. Nope. In fact, the outputs look more like activities. I mean, some will look more like outcomes. Scratch that. The outputs, to me, probably are more like outcomes. All right? Clarice says the activities are not specific enough. That's exactly right. Now, one of the problems that you have with a Logframe is that you're only writing selective activities, so that's almost always going to be true, and that's the reason why when you come to implementing a project, just before implementation, you're going to do detailed planning through your work breakdown structure that will provide a lot more detail in the activities. But obviously these activities that are listed here are certainly not detailed enough. That's a great point. All right, so those are a couple of the things. Let me go ahead and give you sort of the slide that shows, this is what Gus was talking about, is that these outputs, reduce volume of fecal waste discharged into the river and reduce volume of household refuse directly dumped into the river. Those are probably higher level changes that are not totally under the control of the project manager. You also could look at the outcome, and you could say that's probably too general for an outcome. That probably belongs into the goal. So we're going to shift that up to the goal. And then you look at the goal and you think, to contribute to improved health, particularly of under fives and the general health of the river ecosystem, that's actually two different goals, two different projects. One would be related to health and the other would be related to ecosystem. Now they might both contribute to the same program goal, but that would have to be then shifted up to the program goal level. So that then, if you're going to shift those up, that makes a lot of sense, and I hope some of you are seeing that. But that means then you need to provide more detailed outputs and probably more detailed activities. And that's where you probably would need to add something tangible here, like if you're going to reduce the volume of fecal waste discharged into the river, then you probably need to do something like build latrines or help community members to build latrines, have public. If you're going to get people to stop throwing their household refuse into the river systems, then you're probably going to have some kind of tangible activity like a household awareness campaign, those types of things. And then, of course, I didn't go into the details on the activities, but you'd have to have activities that would logically contribute to each one of these outputs. All right? So you've got to have this level sufficient to contribute to the change at this level sufficient to contribute to the change at this level, and then on up if you want to do the program goal. All right, any comments or questions there? Because now I'm going to move on to the rest of the log frame. We're going to talk about the horizontal logic of the log frames, the rest of the story. And the horizontal logic of the log frame has to do not only with this column, the vertical logic, but it has to do with this column, the assumptions. So the horizontal logic is the combination of the hierarchy of objectives and the assumptions. It doesn't really have to do with the two middle columns, the indicators and the means of verification, even though I've seen people try to make that relationship, at least in the way that it's done in the PMD Pro. It's not done that way. So the horizontal logic goes like this, that it says that you can complete all of your activities, but you also need to make sure that the assumptions at this level hold true. Now, the reason why these are read at the output and the outcome level and not at the activity and the goal level is that these are the two most important levels of assumption in the log frame. So let me go to the outputs, because it's essential that you do the activities to produce the outputs, and that you do produce all of the outputs that will contribute to your outcomes, but you also have to have your assumptions hold true. And then if your assumptions hold true at the output level, then you will contribute to your outcomes. If your assumptions hold true at the outcome level, then you will contribute to your goal. So the vertical hierarchy of objectives is only conceptual. It's not practical. Practically, you have to add in the assumptions. So you have to say that if you accomplish your activities and your assumptions hold true, then you'll produce your outputs. If you produce your outputs, and if your assumptions at the output level hold true, then you'll contribute to your outcomes. If you produce your outcomes and your assumptions at the outcome level hold true, then you'll contribute to your goal. So that's the horizontal logic of the log frame. So you have to have both a vertical logic and a horizontal logic in order to have a complete log frame. Okay, that's the way that I look at it. Now the other two columns with the indicator and means of verification, just so you know where I am now, I'm going to talk about these two columns, and then I'll say a little bit more about assumptions before we wrap up for today. An indicator then, as somebody said when I started out, they are big challenges, and they are probably the next most important part after you sort of get your vertical and horizontal logic set, is to get your indicators that are usually both qualitative and quantitative. We usually have both kinds of measurements, even though sometimes we can overemphasize one or the other and need to be pushed in another direction to try to increase either quantitative or qualitative, but depending on the project and the context, both are important. Indicators allow follow-up, the extent to which the project outputs, outcome, and goal are being and have been achieved. In other words, we can see our indicators of progress, indicators that we're producing the deliverables that we said we would. They're the essence of trying to identify variances. You don't know whether or not you have variances unless you have somehow baselined where you're starting and then measuring on a regular basis where you are at a certain point so that you know whether or not you're accomplishing what you wanted to, whether or not you have a gap between what was intended and what your actual progress is. So the indicators are extremely important. And in the simplest form, indicators are just a sign that something is wrong, like a toothache's a sign that you need to have something done to your teeth, maybe go to a dentist. Your alarm clock goes off telling you it's time to wake up. The indicators are just telling you something needs to be done. Most of us have heard this: SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant or realistic, sometimes time-bound, that indicators need to be all of these. And yes and no. More and more we're saying that the log frames themselves as a whole need to have all of these components. If you tried to put all of these into every single indicator, they might be a bit unwieldy or too long. We used to say when the SMART first came out that the objectives needed to be SMART. Then they said later on that the indicators need to be SMART. I would say the log frames need to be SMART. Why do I say log frames? Because sometimes we're not actually going to put the numbers into the actual main log frame table itself. We're sometimes going to produce an indicator tracking table. That's a good thing, because then when you have an indicator tracking table, it's easier to make changes when you do measurements, because sometimes you don't have your baseline measurements, or you're estimating when you're writing your log frame. You may actually do a baseline when you start implementation, or at some point after you've written your proposal or your main project documents. So I'm just saying, I think these SMART, this is a good framework, but that you just need to make sure you've got them somewhere in the project before you start up. So first of all, specific, you have to have each indicator measuring each objective. That's fundamental. Measurable, will the indicator assess objectively and independently? Is it measurable? Is it achievable? Is it possible for the objective to accomplish what is being measured by the indicator? Is it relevant? Is it applicable to the context? Is it practical, cost-effective? And is it time-bound? Can it be measured within the time frame of the project activities and outputs itself? Okay, so your log frames need to be SMART. Now, there's something called indirect or proxy indicators. And indirect or proxy indicators refer to an indirect way of measuring, indirect way to the subject of interest, indirect way to the subject of interest. There can be several reasons to formulate indirect indicators. First of all is that you just can't measure directly. There are some things that it's just not possible, or the subject matter is too sensitive. The subject of analysis can't be done, or it's not cost effective. So let me just ask you a question again. Reflecting on your own project management experience, your own projects, can you think of an example of an indirect or a proxy indicator? Let me see if somebody can come up with one. I'm going to turn off my mic, and then I'll share a couple of examples or talk about the ones that you provide. Type it in or put it on the screen and raise your hand. Go for it, Mike.
I'll contribute, but it's also a question to you. I did a lot of health activities that used the Steps for Health curriculum for UNICEF, which talked about practices that led to improved village community health, basically. And the proxy indicators on that, they could be twofold. On one hand, it was knowledge of the norms and standards for improving health, things like hand washing, preparation of food, knowledge of use of latrines. So that could be one proxy, which is if you know, then you're more likely to practice. On the other hand, even if you could measure they were practicing, things like hand washing, you weren't necessarily showing an improvement in health. So you were making a logical assumption that if you observed them hand washing, you were assuming they were improving health. So I'm curious, there's kind of a proxy on two levels there, one of knowledge of practice, and the other is practice leading to improved health. And I'm just curious what you'd reflect on those.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And whenever we do any kind of try to do behavior change, you often have to find those proxies. So, for example, I'm training you on Logframes, and I want you to be able to use Logframes more effectively in your work. Okay, can I come into your workplace today and watch you do a Logframe and see if you've actually learned? Well, probably not, because I'm not where you are and nobody's going to pay me to do that, et cetera, et cetera. So I can ask you a question. What's the purpose of a Logframe? What's the hierarchy of objectives? And you can give me a response based upon what you have heard, what you understand. And then I can say, oh, you understand the hierarchy of objectives. You know what vertical logic and horizontal logic are. You understand the definition of indicator. Therefore, you know how to do Logframes. So that then I would say that's a proxy. Knowledge is a proxy for actually behavior change, but it's a weak one. I think that's what you're saying, Mike, which is definitely true. Yeah. Yeah, so we always are using proxies because, especially if we're dealing with higher level changes, we just cannot afford to actually look at people's behavior everywhere all the time. A couple of examples that I've heard as I've sort of taught this, and these are relatively simple ones that have to do with drought monitoring, for example. In West Africa, I've heard of an example. It's very common to have localized droughts where you might have an area, especially in the sub-Saharan African regions, that is very dry, and people might have had crop failures in a local region. So it's really good to try to monitor where those are, so that then some kind of assistance can be given to people who are under stress. And a lot of the people who are most vulnerable are in the nomadic tribes, the people who are moving around from place to place. So one person has said that there's a proxy measurement, an indirect way of measuring this kind of stress, that you can monitor the number of cattle that are coming into markets, and have to be a larger village or a town that would have a market, and so somehow you would just count the number of cattle that were being brought in to be sold. If there's a surge in the number of cattle on a particular market day, that is a proxy indicator that something is happening somewhere that is causing nomadic people to sell their cattle, because their cattle, being their most prized possession, would only be sold if they really had to have money for emergency food purchases, that type of thing. Another one, some of you might be involved in changing behaviors that are related to health or hygiene or sexual behavior. People pretty much don't want you coming into their bathrooms and bedrooms and observing their behavior. So you have to use proxies. You have to use focus group interviews, asking people about their behaviors, or in some cases maybe looking at how much people are purchasing items such as soap or condoms or something like that as a proxy of whether or not they're actually using them. Okay, so proxy indicators are extremely important as well. Okay, so that's a type of indicator. Moving on to the rest of the log frame, the means of verification. This is not really too complicated. The means of verification are the way that you're going to measure the indicators. They got to be practical, cost-effective. Sometimes I see on Logframes household survey, and that's fine. But just the realization is that a household survey is extremely expensive, time-consuming type of measurement. So if you're going to put that into a log frame, you have to make sure that you've got the budget to do it, the resources, people, all of that. So must be practical, cost-effective, building on existing information. Wherever there is information that exists that is reliable, you should use it. Don't measure if you don't have to. Specific sources from which the status of indicators for objective results in the log frame can be obtained. And examples of those then would be household survey, rapid appraisal, focus groups, administrative records, and I would usually say must be specific. What types of records? I see too often records, household surveys, records. Be specific, because whoever is going to actually do the measurement, they're going to need to know what records and make sure that those records are available, where they're going to find them. Focus groups, administrative records, secondary data from government sources. So all of those can be means of verification. All right, finally, in the last few minutes here before I wrap up, assumptions. Now, we say in the PMD Pro that these cells are the crux, and crux means the most essential, the focal point of the project log frame for project management. Now, that's not usually what people who've done log frames think. My experience is that you sort of fill in the assumptions just to get the log frame done. But really, the assumptions are the most important, and here's why. First of all, the assumptions are important because of the horizontal logic, that you have to have assumptions in order to complete the logic. The assumptions are the positive conditions, the positive statements that must be true in order for the logic to be complete in the log frame itself. However, even more importantly, each assumption in the log frame needs to be turned into a negative statement, and then it should be used as the start of the risk management strategy or the risk register. So every assumption then in the log frame becomes a risk, and then that's the start of your risk management strategy. So just for example, let me see if I've got this on the next slide. Yeah, for example, here are some assumptions for that project that I showed you. This is actually from the case study from the PMD Pro, where you're actually going to try to clean up a river by reducing the volume of fecal waste, by constructing latrines and having sanitation awareness campaigns and that type of thing. All right, so an assumption is that raised awareness will assure adoption and continued latrine usage. Now that's a good assumption, because if you're raising awareness and it's not actually changing behaviors, then that's a problem. That's not, your project's not going to succeed. This one's an even bigger one, and probably what we call a killer assumption, which means if this assumption here doesn't come true, then this project is dead in the water. We want to reduce the volume of fecal waste discharged into the river. Now, we may be doing this successfully in a particular village, so that no new sources of water pollution are coming from the village that we're helping, but there might be a village upstream that isn't doing anything, or actually increasing their discharge into the river, or there may be an industry, a factory, that's polluting the river. So even though we may be successful in the project that we're designing for a particular village, if this upstream situation exists, then we've just totally negated anything that we've done. So that's a killer assumption. So that's extremely important risk that this project must look at. They must say, okay, what happens if the upstream villages or factories continue to pollute? That's going to be a problem. So maybe then the project has to be expanded or changed in order to include those other villages. So those are examples of how important the assumptions are to the actual management. Okay, I'm finished. What's the purpose of the Logframe? Do you remember? Well, of course, the purpose is it's a systematic overview of what you're going to do. It's a snapshot. It's a risk management strategy. In the PMD Pro, though, we say a couple of things that I haven't mentioned so far, is that especially when we're looking at the higher level of objectives, it's telling us, are we doing the right things? So, for example, that example I just showed you about cleaning up the discharge from a particular village, are we doing the right things? Is that enough? Should we be working with maybe a set of villages? Should we be working somehow in coordination with the whole river system in order to get things done right? Is actually working directly with a village the right thing to do? Should there be some kind of policy work that's done, advocacy work with government? We need to make sure that we're doing the right things, the right projects. And then at the very practical level, then, are we doing those things right? Are we accomplishing the outputs? Are we doing the activities, providing the inputs that are important to make those things happen? So we basically say in project management that we've got to be able to do both of those, and the logical framework then provides the starting point to make sure that we have got things designed correctly. Finally, the question that we always ask in PMD Pro, is the scope as presented in the Logframe comprehensive and detailed enough? And we mean detailed enough to actually do project implementation. And the answer to that is no. You have to have a more detailed planning process that comes after your proposal or your design has been written, after you've got your money in hand, after your staff have arrived. Then you have to go into your detailed implementation planning. The tools that we often talk about there are the ones that are going to list out all of the activities that you're going to be doing, showing the sequencing of activities, and then showing the detailed budgets, resources that are necessary to accomplish each of those. And that's sort of how we tie in the Logframe to the overall planning process. Okay, so that's kind of the spiel on Logframes that I wanted to provide. Those of you who are live here today, if you've got any comments or questions, I'd welcome those right now. Those who are listening to the recording, I hope that you can find some resources to answer your questions if after listening to this you've still got some things that haven't been clarified. So Mike, and I'm going to turn it back over to you. If you've seen anything that I haven't, then bring it to my attention. Open it up for any other questions, but over to you.
Roger, first I want to thank you. I actually have covered this material many times, and you presented it in a way that actually brought up some really interesting and new points for me, so just great job on that. I do not have anything from the chat that's come forward. I'll let Julia correct me if I'm incorrect, but I do know we have a few minutes here if anybody had any questions or comments at this point, or any challenges in your own work that you'd like to share with Roger to see if he has any reflections or ideas. If not, we will end a few minutes early, but I do want to take advantage of your knowledge before we tie things up. Okay, so let me propose that we finish right now, and there is your email address if you need to reach Roger and would like to connect him. And if anybody would like to stay on and continue one-on-one discussion after other people leave the room, we'll stay on for about another 5 minutes or so. And yes, so Robert does have a question. He's wondering how everyone uses Logframes in their organization. Let's stay on, and if people would like to have that conversation, please do. And otherwise, those of you who would like to sign out, go right ahead. And I will thank you all. So see you next time at our next webinar, and we'll be on for another 5 minutes or so.